Thousands of men committed mass murder and told the world they had no choice. For decades, the world believed them. What if that was the most successful lie in history? Here is what they said at Nuremberg. The men who shot civilians into ditches, who loaded children onto cattle cars, who participated in the systematic murder of 6 million people. They all said the same thing. We had no choice. Refuse and you'd be shot. It became the story, written into memoirs, repeated in courtrooms, accepted by millions. But here is the question that almost nobody asked. What actually happened to the soldiers who did refuse? Not what people claimed happened after the war. Not what they said when lawyers were present and their lives were on the line. What actually happened? I'm going to show you exactly what the evidence shows, and I want you to notice something as we go through it. Notice how familiar it feels. To understand what happened when soldiers refused, you have to understand the machine they were refusing inside of. The German military during World War II wasn't just disciplined. Obedience was its religion. The German word for it, Gehorsam, didn't simply mean follow orders. It meant honor, duty, the complete subordination of individual judgment to the collective will of the institution. And violations had consequences, real ones. The Wehrmacht, Germany's military, executed approximately 15,000 of its own soldiers during the war. 15,000. Not for treason, not for espionage, for writing letters home that expressed doubt about the war, for comments made in bars, for telling another soldier they didn't want to fight anymore. People were shot for letters. So when veterans said they had no choice, it didn't sound like a lie. It sounded like obvious truth. Of course you couldn't refuse. Of course the machine crushed anyone who stepped in front of it. Except, the historians who looked most carefully at the actual documented cases found something that didn't fit the story at all. And when they found it, the entire framework of the conversation collapsed. The man who broke this question open was an American historian named Christopher Browning. He didn't look for the dramatic cases. He didn't study the known monsters. He studied the ordinary men, specifically a unit called not SS fanatics, not hardened soldiers, middle-aged German men, police reservists from Hamburg, men with jobs, families, ordinary lives, men who, in Browning's own words, were quite literally ordinary. On the morning of July 13th, 1942, they were ordered to a small Polish village called Józefów. Their orders were simple and monstrous. Round up the Jewish population, separate the working-age men for labor, and kill everyone else, the women, the children, the elderly, approximately 1,500 people. Their commanding officer, Major Wilhelm Trapp, a man his soldiers called Papa Trapp because of his gentle manner, delivered these orders in person. And according to multiple witnesses, he was close to tears. Trapp was crying when he gave the order to kill 1,500 people. And then he said something that no one expected. Trapp told his men, "If any of you feel unable to do this, step out now. No punishment. Different duties, no questions asked." One man stepped out immediately. A handful of others followed as the day went on. Most of them stayed. By nightfall, Reserve Police Battalion 101 had shot approximately 1,500 Jewish civilians in the woods outside Józefów. And the men who stepped out? Not shot, not imprisoned, no formal punishment of any kind. The worst thing they faced was the awkward silence of colleagues who had stayed and couldn't look at them. Social discomfort. That was the price of refusing to participate in a mass murder. And now we have to ask the question that cuts deepest. Not, why did some men refuse? But, why did almost everyone else stay? Browning's answer is laid out in his book, Ordinary Men, and it is one of the most disturbing things written about human behavior in the last century. It wasn't fear of death that kept those men in line. It was something far more ordinary. It was not wanting to be the guy who stepped out. The look on your colleague's face. The judgment in your superior's eyes. The label of being the one who couldn't handle it. The social cost of being different when everyone around you was the same. These men killed 1,500 people partly because stepping out of a group felt harder than pulling a trigger. If that sits wrong with you, hold that feeling. Because it's supposed to. Around the same time Browning was doing his research, A social psychologist at Yale named Stanley Milgram was running experiments that would have seemed absurd if the results weren't so consistent. His setup was simple. A volunteer sits at a panel of switches. An authority figure in a lab coat tells them to administer electric shocks to a person in the next room whenever they get an answer wrong. Shocks increase with every mistake. The dial runs from 15 volts, labeled slight shock, all the way to 450 volts, labeled simply XXX. The person in the next room screams, begs them to stop, says their heart is hurting. Then, silence. The silence is the worst part. The authority figure just says calmly, "Please continue. The experiment requires it. You have no other choice." Before running the experiments, Milgram asked psychiatrists to predict results. Their answer: fewer than 1% of participants would go all the way to 450 volts. Sadists, essentially. Outliers. Nobody normal. 65% of ordinary Americans administered the maximum shock. 65. No gun to their head. No ideology. No threat of any kind. Just a calm man in a lab coat. And most of them did it anyway. But here's what Milgram also found. And this almost never gets mentioned. An act of refusal changed everything. When participants saw another participant refuse, compliance dropped dramatically. One person stepping out made it possible for others to step out. Which means the handful of men who stepped away at Józefów didn't just protect themselves from personal participation, they created a door, and some men walked through it. Now here's what makes this more complicated. Refusing didn't mean walking free. The most common outcome? Reassignment. Different unit. Logistics? Guard duty. Uncomfortable. Not a death sentence. The second? Social punishment. Contempt from peers. Worst rotations. Being passed over. Psychologically brutal, but survivable. The third, and yes, this did happen, formal punishment. Military court. Penal battalions. Frontline positions with near certain death. Terrifying. But still not execution for the specific act of refusing to shoot civilians. The historians who searched hardest for those exact documented cases, soldiers quietly refusing a massacre order, no additional insubordination, then shot for it, did not find them in meaningful numbers. That absence doesn't prove they never happened. But it's significant that the historians who wanted to find those cases didn't find them. And then there is one man whose story proves, beyond argument, that the door existed. His name was Albert Bettel, German army officer, lawyer in civilian life, stationed in the occupied Polish city of Przemyśl in 1942. In July of that year, he learned the SS was coming to deport the Jewish workers his unit depended on. He drove to the bridge leading to the ghetto, and he blocked it. At gunpoint, he turned the SS trucks away, personally, then moved the workers and their families into army jurisdiction. The SS reported him immediately. His career was destroyed. No more meaningful postings, monitored for the rest of the war. He lived with the professional consequences until he died in 1952. He was not shot. 29 years after his death, Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Memorial Authority, recognized him as righteous among the nations, the first German military officer ever to receive that designation. Bettel didn't have access to some extraordinary moral code unavailable to other men. He just chose differently, paid a real price, and survived. In 1961, one of the key architects of the Holocaust sat in a glass booth in Jerusalem, and what he said shocked everyone. For the wrong reason. Adolf Eichmann didn't rant, didn't express ideology, didn't perform either remorse or defiance. He was calm, precise, bureaucratic. He said he had followed orders, that the system was total, that individual moral agency inside it was not a meaningful concept, that he was, in his own words, a small cog in a very large machine. The philosopher Hannah Arendt was in that courtroom, and what she wrote about what she saw scandalized the world. She called it the banality of evil, not because what Eichmann did wasn't monstrous, but because the man who did it wasn't. He wasn't a fanatic. He wasn't a sadist. He was an organizer, a logistics expert, a man who processed paperwork and optimized systems and apparently never spent much time asking what the systems were for. He was ordinary, which was exactly what made his crimes extraordinary. The Eichmann trial, Milgram's experiments, Browning's research, all running within years of each other, all arriving at the same conclusion. The capacity for the Holocaust didn't require a broken or monstrous person. It required ordinary psychology, placed under the right conditions. So here is what the evidence actually shows. German soldiers were not systematically executed for refusing to participate in civilian massacres. The Nuremberg defense, while not entirely fiction, was dramatically, strategically overstated. Those who refused paid real costs: career destruction, social exile, dangerous reassignments, sometimes formal punishment with lethal risk, but survivable. And survivable changes everything. Because if the price was survivable, if refusal was dangerous but not automatically fatal, then the question shifts entirely. It stops being, what did the system force people to do? And becomes, what did people choose inside the system? That is a much harder question, because it can't be answered by pointing at a machine. There is a man named Heinrich Bergmann who appears in the post-war testimony records, a member of a police unit in occupied Poland. When his unit was ordered to participate in a shooting action, he walked up to his superior officer and said simply, he could not do it. No regulation cited, no medical claim, no elaborate justification. Just, I cannot do this. He was reassigned to supply work. He spent the rest of the war driving trucks. Other members of his unit remembered him, some with contempt, some without judgment. One man, interviewed decades later, remembered him with something that sounded like the beginning of envy. Bergmann survived the war, went home, resumed his life. The records don't tell us much more, but he is in the records. And that fact, that the system processed his refusal and produced him driving trucks instead of dead, is the piece of evidence that sits at the center of everything. He found the narrow space, and in doing so, he answered the question the Nuremberg defense tried to make unanswerable. The door existed. The system didn't lock it. Most people just never tried to open it. And that, not the horror, not the scale, not the machinery, that is what history is really asking us to sit with. Because somewhere, in some form, in some institution or group or moment of pressure you will face, the door will be there again. The question is whether you'll look for it.